All right, thanks everyone, and welcome to the special meeting of September 9th, 2025. And as always, just want to acknowledge our meeting today on the unceded traditional territories of the Comox First Nation. And we have one item of business, a presentation from Camagway Cultural Society. And it's a pleasure to welcome Chief Rob Everson to give a presentation. And then I believe if he's interested, we'd like to have some time for Q&A afterwards. So if you want to come up to the podium, we'll just get you all set up. Thank you.
Oh, now we're in trouble. All right. And sorry for being late. Apparently I don't know if you've noticed, but there's construction on the dike. And I don't know who's in charge of that, but just saying that it seems to be an issue. Just as a Comox Valley resident, it's definitely an issue. And thanks for having me today. And so about I don't know how long ago now, but we had sent the mayor and council from all of the municipalities from the Comox Valley to the North Island, as well as the regional district directors, as well as each and every Indigenous community, all the elected chiefs and councillors. We sent them this little booklet that we created, and it's really just an overview. It's a starting point, if you will, on where we are today, where we come from, because I think one of the things that we recognize, and we recognize this for a very long period of time, is many Canadians, British Columbians, people that live in the Valley don't really understand the history of this country with regards to Indigenous peoples. And only through dialogue, through looking at the history, looking at where we are today and comparing that with the history that we have experienced for a very long period of time, can we start to actually have open dialogue and come up with some ideas on how do we move forward from where we are today? As everyone knows, about 3 weeks ago or so, there was a court ruling. The Cowichan and a few other Indigenous communities won that landmark BC Supreme Court case, and this is, we did this a long time ago, and I think that by seeing what's going on, seeing those court cases that are unfolding again and again, and starting to have this understanding that, oh, are we asleep at the wheel? Are we not paying attention to the world in which we live in? Are we not being prepared for the future? And I think that's what this is really about. And we called this booklet Cultural Erasure because, when we start to think about where we are today, and more specifically, next year, 2026 will mark 150 years of this. 150 years of the Indian Act being in place in the country of Canada. And when we talk about cultural erasure, when we talk about racism or systemic racism in the country of Canada, many of us as descendants of immigrants, when we look and think about systemic racism, we think about, oh yeah, there was systems that were in place in this country that were very bad, right? They were horrible. The head tax with regards to those immigrant workers working on the railways and other large infrastructures, that was terrible. When we think about the Japanese internment during World War II, holy smokes, could you imagine trying to do that today? Unbelievable systems that we created as a country based on race that had a negative impact on people. But when we think about systems today in the country of Canada based on race that still exist, there is one, and that is called the Indian Act. And next year we are going to celebrate 150 years of this being implemented in this country. And when we talk about the erasure of culture, this is what the erasure of Indigenous culture is based upon. The Indian Act was created in part to help eliminate culture, language of Indigenous people across the country. That, coupled with the residential schools and many of the other things that were happening, really were implemented to erase Indigenous people, to make us all the same. If you remember in 1969, let's see, look around the room. Well, there's a few. Edwin certainly will remember back in the day. 1969, the white paper, the federal government of Canada came up with this bright idea. I think it was Jean Chrétien, and I think Pierre Elliott Trudeau was in part to that. And they came up with this bright idea that, you know what, Canadians should just all be the same. And I agree. There should be some sort of equality in this country. So they came up with this idea and they said, you know what, we have this idea. Let's just get rid of reserves. Let's get rid of reserves and make everyone equal. We'll just give the land to Indigenous peoples. It'll be theirs. Well, and we'll just all move on. 1969. What did Indigenous leaders say across the country? Well, they converged on Ottawa and basically confronted the government of Canada and said, okay, you got a plan. I like the plan. I like this equality thing. But if you want to erase this Indian Act, if you want to eliminate reserves, that's cool. If you want to eliminate your responsibility to the Indigenous peoples that you instituted in 1876 under the Indian Act, then let's do that. But before you do that, I guess in concert to that, you need to sign over all the land back over to us. Remember what the government of Canada said at the time? Forget it. Let's not worry about it. Let's just go back to the way it is. I met with and I won't say who, but I met with an MLA about a month ago, and we were talking about about things and about how things are today. And this was before the Cowichan decision. And that MLA said to me with a straight face, said, you know what, my constituents, we have this grassroots movement that we believe that what we should do is just, you get to keep all of your reserve lands. We'll just make it fee simple so that you'll be able to prosper. And I looked at this individual and said, I don't know if you remember the 1969 white paper, but that's exactly what was in that 1969 white paper. And Indigenous people at that time said the same thing I'm going to say to you, is that's all good and well, but where is the wealth? Where is the land? And when we talk about cultural erasure, boy, where do we start? It starts with many things. It starts with, simple land acknowledgements. I listened to the land acknowledgement today, and usually it triggers me a little bit when I hear land acknowledgements, because a lot of times, in our ignorance, we acknowledge the Indian bands of the land that are, in the area where we're living and working. The Comox First Nation, before they changed their name legally, was called the Comox Indian Band. So that still exists today. The treaty, I know, has been signed and ratified by the membership, but it hasn't been ratified by the government of Canada. And I'll maintain that, if we look at the Comox First Nation, it was back after 1995 under the Brian Mulroney administration with the self-governing policy that they said, you know what? After that, they said nations can start changing their names legally. They don't have to be called Indian bands anymore. Come up with your own name. That's okay. So, Comox Indian Band, like many other Indigenous communities, decided that, you know what, let's call ourselves the First Nation. Comox First Nation. It unifies. It's just better. It's not so stuck in the Indian Act and colonial. But the reality is, the Comox First Nation is still the Comox Indian Band legally. And all the governance, all the the programs, everything. Guess what? Still goes through this thing right here called the Indian Act. So when you acknowledge as a land acknowledgement, and when you acknowledge the local Indian band, whether it's called the nation, the First Nation, the Squamish is called the Squamish Nation. They're still an Indian band. And there's many other nations that call themselves First Nations, but they're still Indian bands. And when we start to acknowledge the Indian bands across the country of Canada, what do we acknowledge as the authority within culture, within language, within the people that are there? We acknowledge that the government of Canada, through the Indian Act, has that ultimate authority. And that's a problem. It's just one small part of cultural erasure. Every time we start using words like that, it erases the memory of the people that have been there since time memorial. And I'll just share with you. Did I print off the wrong thing? Oh no, that's something else. Geez. Well, there's stacks of paper all over the place, and we're doing a renovation right now, so I couldn't even find these, and my wife had moved them and whatever. But then I was like, oh no, did I pick up the wrong stack? I'll just read you something here. And it talks a little bit about the local community. And this excerpt comes from George Mitchell, who it was was very knowledgeable with regards to Comox history. George Mitchell comes from the Saskatchewan people. And this information was gathered back in 1936. No one here born before 1936, I don't think. Nope, I think we're all after. And so and it says that describing sometime in the recent past, Mitchell emphasized that KFN member and Pentlatch chief Joe Nimnim's ownership of the Courtney River and the weirs that belong there, noting that no one could take salmon from the river until Nimnim had done so. What does that say to you? Well, it says that there was a hierarchy. It says that within the Comox Indian band, which existed at that time, that there was a hierarchy that still was maintained since before this idea of colonization. And Joe Nimnim, being a Pentlatch chief, was the first person, his family before anyone else, took fish. They had access to the resource before anyone else, including other Indigenous people that lived within the community. And I think that when we think about that, it says here again, talking about George Mitchell, it says that even though there were other people that were more numerous than the Pentlatch people, they, including George Mitchell and other Indigenous people from the Saskatchewan and the Satluk people that migrated here, they continued to acknowledge and respect Nimnim's Pentlatch inherited rights and prerogatives. These protocols that this is Pentlatch land and the Pentlatch people should be fed first. What does that say to us all when we start thinking about cultural erasure and land acknowledgements and talking about where we live today? And I've said it in many venues in the Comox Valley before, and I'll say it again. This place should not be called the Comox Valley. This place should be called the Pentlatch Valley. At one time in the 1800s, the maps that were circulated, the lake that we call Comox Lake right now was called Pentlatch Lake, acknowledging the first peoples of this land, of this territory. And I think when we continue to use the words Comox Valley, Comox Lake, it erases the original people that live here. So we have to be cognizant of things like that. And I think that at the end of here, it's just an excerpt that says, Mitchell's example underscores the importance of ownership and rights when understanding the cultural context of the fishing system, the rivers that contain those traps among Indigenous peoples in the area. So it's an issue. And this is just one example of many examples of. And when we talk about cultural erasure and the Indian Act and what the effects of these are today, we don't have to go very far. Someone once asked me back in 2015, isn't it unbelievable to think that it's been 10 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out? It's been a decade, 10 years since that commission report came out. And when we think about those calls to action within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and when we think about them, and there was many, we start to think about where we are today with regards to rights and title. And when we start to think about those, going back to thinking about, back in 2015, I remember someone asked me, they said, Rob, and I think it was a reporter or someone, and they said, Rob, we see this report's come out, this commission report, everything looks like that, rah, everything's going to be great. It looks like Canada is ready to take the next step to reconcile with Indigenous peoples across the country. And they said, what would your idea of reconciliation be with regards to Indigenous peoples across the land? And I had to think about it because I'd never been asked that question. And I thought, you know what? I said, I think that Canada and Indigenous people across this country can be truly reconciled when the statistics of Indigenous people are no different than anyone else. And when we start to think about statistics, oh my gosh, you know, the statistics of Indigenous peoples in this province are nothing short of shameful. They're embarrassing. As a British Columbian, as a Canadian citizen, we should be collectively ashamed of the statistics of Indigenous people in this country, in this province. It's unbelievable. When we think about incarceration rates, you know, across the country, Indigenous men make up over 30% of the men incarcerated in federal penitentiaries. And for women, it's appalling. Women make up over 50% of all women incarcerated in federal penitentiaries. And in British Columbia, Indigenous women make up over 50% of all women in federal or provincial institutions in this province. You got to remember that Indigenous people across this country only represent about 5% of the general population. When we think about suicide rates, when we think about addictions and overdose, Indigenous people are at the pinnacle of those statistics. When we think about children in this province, do you know the percentage of Indigenous children under the care of the Ministry of Child and Family Services? Anyone? You care to guess? What do you think? What's a number? Throw out a number. What do you think? Too much. That's a good number. I watched it on TV about a year ago. Indigenous children make up 68% of the children in care by this province's Ministry of Child and Family Services. 68%. Indigenous people make up 5% of the general population. I seen a report come out last year that said that the life expectancy of an Indigenous person in this province, it has gone down. It went down over a period of years. Went down from like 73 point something to 67.23 or 11 years old. 67, just over 67 years old is the average life expectancy of an Indigenous person in this province. In that same time frame, the life expectancy of the average Canadian went up to 83 years old. And I thought, wow, that's 83. That's getting up there, right? I thought, what is that on the world stage? What does that mean? Did you know that at 83 point something years old, we rank at number 20 in life expectancy around the world? Number 20 in the world. That's unbelievable. I thought, wow, good for Canada, right? That's something to be proud of. And I thought, whoa, well, if Indigenous people in the province of BC were a country, where would they rank in this kind of ranking system that is established around the world? Did you know that Indigenous people would rank number 160? There are developing countries that have a much better life expectancy than an Indigenous person in this province of British Columbia, in this country called Canada, in 2025. So when we think about cultural erasure, when we think about marginalizing the lives of Indigenous people across the country, within this province, in this valley, it is a serious issue. And you know, we created this not as a document to fight and argue over. We created this as just a starting point. We're just scratching the surface, talking about, you know, there's a history and there's some things going on. How are we going to start talking about this? And again, going back to that Cowichan landmark court case, you know, when that landmark court case came out, you know, our attorney general, Nikki Sharma, what did she say here? She said, we disagree strongly with that decision. Wow, disagree strongly. And let's see, this is from an article. Let's see, and here it is. And she said, you know, our government is committed to protecting and upholding private property rights while advancing the critical work of reconciliation. She said, this case is an example of why the province prefers to resolve land claims through negotiation, where we can protect property rights directly rather than risk considerable uncertainty through court decisions. And I wonder, this court case took 6 years, 6 years in our Supreme Court of British Columbia to get to that decision. 6 years. 6 years, almost 2,000 days. What was the province of British Columbia doing in that period of time to reconcile, to talk, to negotiate? I would say they weren't. They decided to let the court systems do their job, thinking that Indigenous people are going to lose another court case. When we look across the country in the province of British Columbia, we see a trend, and the trend is rights and title. The trend is Indigenous communities, Indigenous people standing up for who they are, who their ancestors were. And it's the lack of continued dialogue, the lack of true engagement with Indigenous peoples locally and regionally that is going to put us collectively, not just in the valley here, but collectively in this province, in trouble with regards to cases like this. Because time and time again, the local communities, the regional governments, and the provincial governments don't want to talk about history. They don't want to talk about the past. And that landmark court case was about fishing and summer fishing village rights that those members of those communities had through hereditary title. Because this was way before the Indian Act. That land was sold off before the Indian Act was ever created. So this decision goes all the way back and predates before the Indian Act existed, meaning, and like the Supreme Court of Canada has said, in order to prove title in this country, you got to prove that you had land here before contact or at the time of contact, not when the Indian Act was imposed or not when the government of Canada decided to create the country called Canada. Rights and title particularly goes back to before contact. And it goes back to hereditary rights. And mark my word, and I talk to people across the country at all levels of government. And the one thing consistently when talking to officials in the federal, provincial government, municipalities across the country, from here all the way to Newfoundland, is this uncertainty about, well, how are we going to deal with, how are we going to work with Indigenous communities? And a lot of the work that I do across the country, we tell them, you know what? You kind of got to work with the Indian band elect system. But if you're not working with, or you're not engaging with, and you're not talking to the hereditary or the traditional leaders within that community, at some point in the future, there will be a Supreme Court case that decides who has ultimate rights and title on the land. And I'm leaning towards, well, the Supreme Court has already said it exists before contact, so it's going to end up being hereditary rights. So what does that do when we start looking at the future? If we're unwilling to, or we're unable to engage with traditional leadership, and it goes back to cultural erasure by skipping by bypassing Indigenous traditional leadership, we may put ourselves in trouble. That's what I wanted to share with you today, and I can take some questions. I think that there's like I said, it's a very brief overview, but I think it's a fairly good read. It talks about Calder and different things, and and to think that 1997, the Dalgamook decision, that's when consultation, this requirement to consult and accommodate really started. 1997, holy crap! It's not even 30 years ago. We haven't been in that consultation era for very long, yet even now we're starting to see more and more decisions landing on the side of Indigenous peoples, like the Cowichan case. So I think that I think it's just a fair warning for us all that we need to sit down and start doing a little bit more thinking and talking and dialoguing about the past and having a good understanding of where we live with regards to Indigenous peoples, with regards to those traditional leaders, with regards to, how do we navigate the waters? And I'm not saying it's easy. It's very complex, especially in the Comox Valley, especially in the Campbell River area. There's so much migration and movement within right here. all the way from Qualicum here, the Campbell River area, so much movement with the Indigenous peoples that live there, in and out, a lot of conflict, a lot of war. So yeah, we know that the history is complex. It's not easy. But I guess, when you voted to be elected, when you're thinking about working for the regional district municipalities, did you think it would be easy? I can well imagine how many calls you're getting every day about the dike. My little complaint aside, right? I mean, it puts a lot of pressure on us. So yeah, I'm willing to take some questions if there's anyone that has any questions, because what do you think? Edwin, come on, you got something.
Thank you, Chief Everson. And I'll turn over to start with Director Brown.
Thank you for this, and thank you for the resource. I did not take the time to read through the Indian Act again, but I have in the past, and it's a horrifying document. But I do appreciate the cultural erasure and that the information and the suggestions in there. And I think, we as local governments, like you say, get into this, well, we're elected, and so we should go to the people who are elected.
Mhm.
And I think there's a huge gap there that we need to figure out a way to fill. And so thank you for doing this work and for bringing it to us to find better ways forward.
Absolutely. Good comments.
Thank you. And we'll go to Director Grieve.
Well, being that Doug and I are the closest thing to an elder here, I think, on our side of the table. Little known is the fact that back when BC was a colony, the early settlers that came here and settled, a lot of them in the, up the Solom River and on the prairie and what have you, because it was easy digging. The Farmers Institute, which was created 153 years ago, which would predate the Indian Act and predate even BC being part of Canada, it was a colony, regularly wrote to the governor, the colonial governor, asking why the First Nations in those days weren't compensated for the land. They saw the inequity back then, and they were shoved aside. So there's actually records in the Times Colonist in Victoria, written by the Farmers Institute in Comox Valley, saying this is an inequity. They should be compensated for these lands, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it was all shoved aside. And I don't think this was well known. It came up at the 150th anniversary of the Comox Valley Farmers Institute. So really, it would have been so much better if we'd settled it back then and had some kind of, some kind of actual equity insofar as property rights go and whatever. But, it's such a shame that history marches on. And here we are now, as you say, it's been since 1997. And I do think we're making progress. I really do. But I mean, it's, opportunities lost. And I always want to make the point that, the robber barons of the 19th century were the ones that drove all this stuff, as you know, and American and Canadian and British mostly. And it wasn't the rank and file. It wasn't the ordinary Joe and Jill out there with, 2 oxen and a handful of chickens, coming to scrape up a living. So all the power to you. We've known each other for a long, long time, and I must say that I certainly appreciated this presentation, and it was well put together and heartfelt. So, thank you so much.
Thanks, Edwin. No questions? Sure.
Director Morin? Perhaps we could find a microphone if you wanted to go sit at the end of this table here, if that's all right. That way the people online can hear you. It's not something we usually do, but happy to provide an opportunity for you to speak. And I'll just turn that on.
Hi, my name is Danita Bilizaze, and I had a question for the people in this room. Is Rob, you talked about the name of what the Comox Valley should be. I'm wondering if there's any discussion around reclamation of language and around land bases. Renaming streets.
And
renaming-
I can
Well,
weigh in
not
on that.
renaming, I mean,
And I can weigh in on that. And I think the complexity of where we live because of the languages, there's 3 separate languages that have been traditionally used here, with Pentlatch being one of them, Ijutham and Kwakwala. So when we start to think about language, it's a very complex, and I think it's a discussion that will involve more than the people here, and it'll involve many community members within, the Comox First Nation, that will be able to bring that forward. Because of course, how would we have signage with 3 different languages? It would be hard. So I don't know if there's any movement towards that, but I think that it would be difficult in acknowledging.
I would say that, just speaking off the cuff, that we have a desire to consider renaming some of the parks. That's already happened at Seal Bay, obviously, and have been working with Comox First Nation. And I think the feedback we received is there are so many pressing priorities at this point in terms of language, retaining language, making the kind of difficult decisions you're talking about, that while this is important, there's just so many other things that are imminent and important as well. And we've tried to take our cues from that as to what there is time for and what seems like a priority. But yeah, I agree. That's certainly a process I think this board would like to see move ahead when it's the appropriate time. And we're certainly doing that in terms of parks. Director Morin, did you want to say something?
Sure. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Rob, for the great presentation. I'll do a little shout out to Dia because I got these beautiful earrings from her today. And just wanted to say that with Truth and Reconciliation Day coming up, it's really important. It's always important, but it's especially important to remember, I think, the artists and supporting Indigenous business and all of that. So I just wanted to give that little that comment. But I guess my question is around, you talk about the complexity, and certainly we all feel it. And yes, we did decide to foray into this and have those difficult conversations, as well as have people upset with us about a multitude of things. I'm wondering if you have any examples of communities that have maybe haven't got things right, but maybe are on the path of kind of dealing with some of the complexities that we are in the Comox Valley. We have elected chief and council, and obviously some of the folks have hereditary status as well often. I mean, I know you did when you were on council. So I guess I'm wondering if there's any examples of how this navigating this complexity has maybe started to happen.
Well, I'll just say 2 things. There are Indigenous communities, particularly like the Noon Channel, that use governing structures that have included and continue to include their hereditary leadership in various means. And I think that when we start to think about most communities in British Columbia and across the country, they're not as complex as here. We are unique, I would say, probably across the country. In most areas of this country, you can go there and say, okay, this is the history of this area. It's one people, one language, one culture, and it's very straightforward. It's easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's easier than here because, but even doing the research and uncovering or rediscovering the truth there can be complex and can be hard to do. When we think about the Comox Valley with the migration of Indigenous peoples from the north and how complex because of war and because of colonization, the beginnings of colonization forced a lot of movement in the late 1700s and the early to mid 1800s, created a lot of movement up and down the coast. And I think in the Comox Valley, the Campbell River area, we probably felt it more than anywhere else because of, let's just face it, the resources in the valley here, the resources in the Campbell River area were they were sought after by many, many different Indigenous peoples. And the warring factions and the things that happened at the time really forced some of that migration into intermarriage, from here down to Qualicum, all the way up through the Campbell River area. And it creates a complex web of, if we go back or look at hereditary or traditional clans or families, then yeah, it's not easy. And would it be an easy path? Probably not. What is the path forward? Well, it's about education. It's about spending time having a real understanding about the history of the Indigenous peoples that are here today and how each of their family groups, each of their clans got to be here in the valley, when, how, and then you can start to see a more clear picture of how the valley became what we see today, and how the Comox Indian Band, Comox First Nation evolved out of that, that migration and that coming together, intermarriage of families. It becomes a lot clearer for everyone, and you can start to sort of unpack. And once you unpack that history, then you have a clear understanding of the specific families that are represented here even today, and the histories that each of those families carry all the way back to the beginning of time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. And Director Elliott.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for presenting to us today. I did read the paper, the research paper, when it was shared with us a few weeks back, and I have no dispute with anything that's in there. And I agree with you that the disproportionate number of Indigenous people in our child welfare and correctional systems is nothing but shameful. I guess the issue, though, becomes how do we move forward? And I'm just really curious on your response to the treaty vote. There was a fairly significant turnout of people, and quite an overwhelming approval of moving forward in that direction. Mm-hmm. But you seem to be speaking against that process, and so I'm just curious how you see that in terms of the number of the Indigenous people who live in the area now and have some affiliation with Comox.
Well, I guess for myself, it'd be hard to, I voted against it, but at this point in time, we're moving forward. So I'm, trying to reconcile that, like many people in our community. I think that, it goes back to what I said earlier. One of the biggest fears that many politicians and business leaders have across the country is this fear of the unknown. If I only work with the elected chief and council, and all of a sudden there's a court case that says you should have talked to the hereditary leaders, what happens then? It's no different than the Cowichan case. Looking at that, and I'm sure that BC and Richmond and Musqueam all thought, no worries, there's no way they're going to win. They won a court case at the BC Supreme Court. So I think that it's the unknown and not being prepared for that. And I think that one of the dangers that we all recognize from government, federal, provincial, municipal, regional, district, we tend to really push our debt onto our descendants, and not just monetary decision making. That the decision making that, like Edwin said earlier, there could have been decisions made 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that would have reconciled many of the things that we're talking about today. But governments, people in charge, decided that, I'd rather have that 100 acres for myself, or I'd rather have control of that for myself and make money off of it today. And let's just worry about it later. And it became the mantra across this country, where governments at all levels said, you know what, let's just push it down to the next generation. And you know what, we're getting to the place where, when you think about the buck stops here, we're getting to that place where the buck is going to stop at some point. And like BC and Richmond and other community members in that area with Lulu Island, yeah, the buck stopped there. And now they're going, oh, what the heck? We thought it was just going to keep moving and we're not going to worry about it for another 100 years. That's not happening. Court cases are being won on a daily basis across the country with Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal title. And more, it's looking like, we got to start paying attention to the history of the peoples that from each and every community and have a better understanding of the place we live in. Otherwise, it's just that, we don't know. And if we don't know, how do we make decisions with faulty information? So like I said, I'm not, we're moving forward with some sort of treaty and how that is implemented. If it is ratified by the government, and we'll have to reconcile that within our own community, right? But even within that, what if 10 years from now the Supreme Court of Canada says you have to deal with hereditary leaders with regards to rights and title?
Yeah.
What is that going to do for all of the, not just our treaty? What's that going to do for Tsawwassen? What's that going to do for all of the decisions that governments at all levels have made? It kind of unravels a lot, right? So I think that it's just a cautionary tale, just speaking to the fact that I think it's coming. I think that these court cases are they're being mounted as we speak, across the country in various fashions. Just speaking to the fact that if we're talking about rights, if we're talking about title, what does that look like, and how do we reconcile that with the past? I don't have the answers. It's an unknown, but it's just one of those things that we all have to be cognizant of as we move forward.
Yeah. I appreciate hearing you say that you are working with the treaty process going forward, and even though you just didn't support it.
Well, I'm not personally doing that, but I'm in the community, I guess.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah, no worries. And when we think about the truth, someone mentioned Truth and Reconciliation, that when that report came out, when we think of those calls to action, I remember looking at a website about a year ago. What's it called? IndigenousWatchdog.org, I do believe. And it's a website dedicated to keeping an eye on the calls to action and how we address them as a country. And I remember, I think they did a press release about a year and a half ago. And they said that, at the rate that we are actually being able to address the calls to action that were brought forward in 2015, it's going to take more than 50 years for us to get through that list and be able to address all of those calls to action brought forward. And if you know anything about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and that report and those calls to action, if you read them, you'll quickly understand that most, if have some connection to and are based on human rights. So it really does beg the question. It's going to take 50 more years for us as a country to address the human rights of Indigenous people. When we talk about equality, when we talk about moving forward, when we talk about our esteemed Attorney General Nikki Sharma saying things like, we need to start working together and not go through the court system. And I'll say then why weren't you working together? Why wasn't the province making inroads to reconcile with those Indigenous communities that had summer villages there since the beginning of time? So, when we start to think about the future, when we start to think about how do we actually start truly demonstrating this positive path forward for reconciliation, it means that we have to start talking and have those hard discussions. They're not easy. There's discussions about the past and residential schools and children being taken away, and what's going on today within the Ministry of Child and Family Services. Not easy discussions. The unbelievable poverty that exists across this country within Indigenous communities, with Indigenous peoples. And why is that? Because they have not been connected to the wealth of the land. I read an article earlier this year, and they said that between 2023 and 2026, the country of Canada is poised to have the largest transfer of wealth in Canadian history. Over $1 trillion is going to be transferred from grandparents and parents to children and grandchildren. And they said there's a group that's been around for a long, long time that are going to be largely left out of that transfer of wealth. Guess who that is? Indigenous people are not part of that transfer of wealth because they have not been connected to the land, and not of their own choosing. They've been disconnected from the land because of the Indian Act, because of the governments across the board marginalizing them and forcing them into a place of poverty. And that exists today. You know, we're very fortunate in the Comox First Nation. You know, I would say that, our poverty level isn't probably as bad as some. It's still bad, but it's not as bad as some. But boy, you go and do a tour of reserves across this country, or even in this province, even on the Vancouver Island, and the poverty is unbelievable. How do we address that as Canadians, as British Columbians? You know, when we talk about those words, equality, how do we get to a place of equality if we're not even willing to take steps to create equity, to create space for Indigenous people, to create wealth, to be part of projects, to generate their own revenue streams so that they can actually be part of society? I think that's what this discussion's all about, is how do we move forward? And I'll just close with saying that the Supreme Court has told us all. The Supreme Court said that, you know what? Immigrants, descendants of immigrants, not going anywhere. Those Indigenous people that live around, in town, on the reserves, they're not going anywhere either. So we have to come up with ways to sit down and have dialogue, have conversations that are meaningful, that make a difference in not only the lives of the people that live within this country and these provinces, but make a difference within the lives of those Indigenous people that live in the community and live on those reserves close by and within that community. How do we do that? And it starts here. It starts by creating documents like this, and for people to say, that's stupid, or, hey, I agree. People are going to go on both sides of the fence, and that's okay. We're not going to have a frank dialogue unless we actually start realizing some of the issues that we all face as British Columbians and Canadians that we have to start dealing with. We have to start talking about. And unless we start having that frank dialogue with one another, we call it kitchen table dialogue. We've called it kitchen table dialogue for many, many years. Unless we sit around the kitchen table with our family, our friends, and the people that we love and start having these conversations, we're not going to be moving at all. This is what we have to do. We have to start dialoguing and talking about the future collectively, and including Indigenous peoples in that conversation, and not just in a way of marginalization where there's tokenism. Right? We got to quit tokenizing our Indigenous peoples and really have Indigenous people be part of the wealth generation across this country, in this province, and we need Indigenous people to be part of our community decision-making capabilities, because this is the land of the Pentlatch people since the beginning of time. Like that excerpt said, for over 1,000 years, those fish weirs and those fisheries have been happening, and about 100 years ago, the Indigenous people that were living then said, yep, the Pentlatch were here first and they get to fish first. We got to remember that. I don't know if there's any other questions. I know I can stay here for another 3 hours and talk if you'd like, but you're probably thinking, I want to go home at some point. And so I'd like to just thank each and every one of you for allowing me to be here, share a little bit about what I know, my opinions on what I see, and kind of what I see the future. The future is unfolding in a certain way, and I think it can be bright for all of us, but we have to include everyone. We can't leave anyone out of that discussion, and we have to have meaningful change within our country to make that happen. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for this really rich discussion. As you probably know, delegations, we are only for 10 minutes, and that's why we scheduled a full hour-long
Perfect.
separate meeting, so we had the time to talk things through. So at some point, we will have to, I guess, move on to the 4 o'clock part of our meeting. I don't know if any directors had anything, a resolution in mind. I had some wording perhaps on, we don't usually make decisions on the day of a delegation, but perhaps a resolution. My suggested wording would be that staff be directed to prepare a report on the CVRD's actions and efforts at Indigenous reconciliation as related to the presentation from Hereditary Chief Rob Everson at the September 9th board meeting. So just to hear what you said and to look at the work we're doing in light of that. It's essentially what this resolution would put forward. So I don't know if anyone cares to second that, perhaps.
I'll move.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Dr. Brown has her light on, so I'll just write that up.
I'm just thinking that we are moving into the end of this term, and I appreciate the report coming back, talking about what we are doing and will continue to do and have done. But I think it would be really valuable, and perhaps you're already thinking about this, Rob, but to have for new electeds next term to have an additional presentation from Comox.
That sounds like Chief Everson, if you were willing to come back, I'm not sure if we need
No.
that's it. That's with you guys.
I've had it with you people.
I don't know if we need a separate resolution if staff understand that that's crucial to bring people into this room, is that they understand our connection to Indigenous communities. So James, you're scribbling. Should we add a second resolution, or should we? Do you think that's understood?
Understood, sir.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you. But I appreciate you underlining it, Dr. Brown. Like that's just an important thing. When, is there any other discussion on this resolution? It had its first and seconder. Is there anyone opposed? Okay, and that carries unanimously. Thanks, Rob.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for the presentation, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Hope you guys have a great day. And, anytime, I'm always available to talk. And I think continue dialogue, no matter what the results are. We got to keep talking. That's at the end of the day. If we stop talking, we're in trouble. And we can't work in silos. We have to work together. And I think we got to try to figure out how do we help create wealth for Indigenous peoples across this country. It's not just here, it's everywhere. There's a serious issue we have to address. So thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great day. And yeah, thanks.